first of all, thank you very much to everybody who's been able to carve out the time to join our webinar today. Hopefully, as you are all aware by now, the focus of today's webinar is going to be on the role of regulation as a driver for sustainable infrastructure investment. And I'll start off with a couple of introductions. So starting off with myself, I'm Eleanor Hughes. I am a managing consultant here at Evora Global, and I lead on our infrastructure service offering. I'm also joined with my two colleagues, Aoife Busher and Bevan Jones. And Aoife Busher, our Associate Director, she leads on our Sustainable Finance Service line here at Evora, and she's going to be talking us through some of the emerging regulations around SFDR and the EU taxonomy. And I'm also joined by Bevan. Bevan is our Director of Net Zero, and Bevan is going to be talking us through some of the climate-related risk regulation led through the recommendations of the TCFD. So in terms of our plan, our content for this afternoon, we're going to start off with some definitions around what is sustainable infrastructure, and we'll also talk about the role of private capital in facilitating that sustainable development. Then we will introduce the topic of regulation as a driving force behind the integration of ESG factors and the redirection of capital towards more sustainable solutions. And at that point, I'll hand over to Bevan and Aoife to unpack some of the two most important regulatory frameworks that we often see that our clients are battling with at the moment. And they'll discuss some of the key challenges and opportunities that we find when applying these reporting frameworks, specifically to the infrastructure space. And then finally, we'll end on a short summary and some recommendations for what investment managers and infrastructure portfolio companies should be focusing on whilst preparing and collecting data for their reporting. And then hopefully we'll have a few moments at the end of the session to finish on a QA. So if anybody has any questions that they'd like to enter into the chat function, please do so, and we will come back to your questions at the end. So we all love to start off with a definition, and I'm sure that you'll all agree that there are a really wide variety of definitions out there when we talk about what is sustainable infrastructure. I think probably the most common definition tends to be the one from the Inter-American Development Bank, which has now also been adopted by the UN Environment Programme. And they define sustainable infrastructure systems as those that are planned, designed, constructed, operated and decommissioned in a manner that ensures economic and financial, social, environmental and institutional sustainability over the entire infrastructure life cycle. It's a bit of a tongue twister, I guess. And often we see that sustainable infrastructure can be framed by the UN SDGs. We know that infrastructure has the ability to address and I guess contribute as well to all 17 of those global targets. So from a social perspective, the purpose, I guess, of infrastructure is to uphold societies through the provision of basic services. So, transportation, resources such as energy and water, access to hospitals and schools, and also promoting connectivity, I guess, through things like data and telecoms infrastructure. However, we know that truly sustainable infrastructure has to go beyond just this pure kind of basic provision of service and actually address some of the kind of aspects of community engagement throughout the entire life cycle, all the way from the planning and construction stages, all the way through to that operational phase. And I think at a more granular level, many projects also have the opportunities to create jobs and facilitate skills development. And this obviously has opportunities to alleviate poverty and reduce, income inequality as well, which is especially in emerging markets where the majority of work, I guess, is required to meet the global targets and the SDGs. Environmental sustainability is obviously also a really key consideration when we're looking at what is sustainable infrastructure. We know that infrastructure has this kind of long-term implication for things around carbon intensity and also greenhouse gas emissions. We know that kind of typical infrastructure projects can range, I guess, anywhere from 50 to 100 years plus. And therefore, we need to consider kind of long-term implications and viability of these infrastructure assets when financing them or planning them. We know that sustainable infrastructure projects, things like renewable energy, clean transport, they all have a really kind of essential part to play in that transition to a low carbon economy and to meet global net zero targets. And finally, obviously, economic development is a really key consideration for sustainable infrastructure. We know that infrastructure can form a really key driver of economic growth and development as it stimulates economic activity, creates jobs and investment, and can lead to kind of longer term economic resilience and wealth for populations. I think when we consider the increasing sort of demand and growth for infrastructure, there are four maybe key drivers that we have to consider. And those are the ones that are kind of showed up on the screen at the moment. So population growth, the economy, urbanization, and also climate change. So population growth, we know that the growth amounts to around 83 million annually, and it's expected by 2050 that the world's population could exceed 9.7 billion. Therefore, population growth is a really significant driver for services that need to not only meet the basic human needs for right now, but also consider the impacts that things could have on future generations and their ability to succeed as well. Increasing urbanization is another really key driver. So we know that by 2050, there could be more than 2/3 of the population that would live in urban areas. And this means that when planning infrastructure, we need to make sure that the right infrastructure assets are installed at the right locations in order to meet that increasing need. In terms of the economy, we know that the economy could double in size by 2050. And that means that I guess there's an expectation here that there'll be substantial technology improvements. And it's noted by a recent IEA report also that 40% of carbon savings are expected to come from technologies that are not presently commercially viable. So this really quick kind of exponential growth of technology, especially in those emerging markets, presents, I guess, quite a unique challenge to consider when deploying future capital. And then finally, in terms of climate change, predictions already are suggesting that by 2050, many key cities could be flooded. And the World Bank estimates that around 143 million people could become climate migrants. Migrants because they're escaping damage caused by things like crop failure, water scarcity, and sea level rise. And therefore, there's this kind of increased demand for climate resilient infrastructure. So I guess kind of what does this mean for private markets? Well, the OECD estimates that around 6.9 trillion US dollars per year are needed to meet this growing demand up until 2050 in order to meet development goals and also create and allow that transition to a more climate resilient future. So I guess with that brings us back to some of these global targets like the SDGs. So in 2014, the UN Conference on Trade and Development put the annual investment gap faced by developing countries to achieve the SDGs at around 2.5 trillion. But a new midpoint review that was undertaken just last year actually put that gap much higher at around 4 to 4.3 trillion. And the increase, I guess, of that gap that they found would be because of the shortfalls of investment combined with a number of global challenges that we've seen play out, such as the pandemic and the food, fuel, and finance crises as well that we've seen play out over recent years. The most recent SDG Investment Trends Monitor breaks down kind of the capital expenditure requirements needed across the key SDG factors. And you can see the findings here on the chart on the left-hand side. So you can see that the kind of need for clean energy makes up more than half of the current investment gap. And that gap includes investments in renewables and things around energy efficiency. Water and sanitation comes in second, and that is a gap of around 500 billion. And this includes water resources, sanitation facilities, and wastewater management. You'll see towards the bottom of that graphic, you've got the social infrastructure sectors. So these generally show a smaller financing gap, a range between around 100 to 500 billion. And most of the financing here is needed for operational expenditures, such as the operation of hospitals and schools. And similarly, there's been a range of studies that are focused on the funding gap that's required in order to meet global net zero by 2050. And the IEA states that around 70% of investments into clean energy would need to come from private sources in order to bridge that current gap. So the figures on the right-hand side of the screen display the quantum of investment versus the reduction that we'll see in greenhouse gas emissions per year. And this is only showing at the moment the US and Europe. And you can see here that not only does the quantum of investment need to dramatically increase from now up until 2030, but also those investments must be sustained out until 2050 in order to actually achieve the desired emissions reduction that we would need. So it's also probably worth mentioning as well on this slide that high income nations have up until now really had the majority share of global private infrastructure investment, whereas potentially those middle and low income countries have attracted a much smaller share. So I think what does all this mean? It means that there's a clear case and opportunity for private capital to close the infrastructure financing gap and to meet these global goals. And I think ultimately, whilst this reallocation of capital is happening organically, perhaps it's just at the moment is not happening quick enough in order to meet these goals. And I guess that brings us on to today's topic for discussion, and that is around regulation. So governments have accepted that they need to do more to give investment managers the tools and the ability to provide a case for investing in more sustainable activities. And more investors now are seeking not only a financial return, but also they want to have opportunities to demonstrate the positive social and environmental impacts that their investments are having. And I guess a key component or a key driver of regulation is to try and give companies a solution. That means that they can actually demonstrate their strong ESG performance, and based on that, they can attract additional investment. Related to that, also a key purpose of regulation is to obviously to improve transparency and make it easier for investors to identify what classifies as green and what is sustainable versus what is not. And I think previously it's been quite hard to decipher kind of between, I guess, statements of intent versus what actions are actually being taken on the ground to embed sustainability and also achieve, real world impact. I think there's obviously a need here for investment decisions to be made using more robust, quantifiable, and ultimately comparable data across various investment managers. In terms of the other factors, obviously risk management is incredibly important. So regulation forces many companies to integrate climate and environmental risks into their broader risk management processes. Maybe perhaps previously sustainability considerations were more of a nice to have. However, new regulations tend to frame ESG as a key risk that could actually hamper financial performance. And that obviously has been met with the need to publish increasing levels of ESG information and disclosure within the financial statement. And then finally, obviously promoting sustainable decision making and ensuring that all companies and investment managers actually meet a minimum threshold is a key driver of regulation to ensure that companies can no longer avoid ESG and I guess increase its overall importance. So I guess it's no surprise overall that investors now kind of name regulation as being one of the most important drivers in terms of changing ESG practices. And in fact, in Fidelity's international ESG survey that they undertook in 2023, over 60% of respondents actually named regulation as being one of the top 3 most important factors that's affecting their ESG practices. So whilst ESG reporting maybe previously was delegated to a sustainability team, now sustainability reporting is considered to be a key performance indicator for companies and also a key KPI for the board or C-suite staff to be involved in. So I think that this paired with the potential sanctions against non-compliance and also the increasing expectations that are now also coming from investors means that the ESG agenda has been leveled up. And obviously, whilst regulation is not the only key factor, you can see there on the left-hand side that other kind of aspects such as increasing investor demand, needing to act with fiduciary duty, and also improve financial returns when actually integrating ESG. These are also really important factors. However, increasing regulation almost nearly comes out as kind of the top driver. So across the market, we've obviously seen over the past kind of couple of years, we've seen an increasing number of frameworks, standards and regulations that are being brought into the market, evolving across various sectors and geographies. These frameworks and standards are created from, a number of different governments and industry groups, which has led to, I guess, what could be considered to be quite a complex regulatory landscape nowadays. On the left-hand side of my screen, I'm showing some of the key regulations that we see amongst the market. So regulations, obviously, these are legal mandatory reporting requirements that are set by a governing body. So, for example, that might be the European Commission in the EU, the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK, and maybe the Securities and Exchange Commission in the US. So some of these examples include CSRD, which is obviously factoring in on the more corporate sustainability angle, the EU taxonomy and SFDR, which are talking around the kind of disclosure of sustainable business activities, and also the SEC climate disclosure, which is looking to focus more on the kind of the disclosure of climate risks. Instead, we have obviously frameworks and disclosure, which are shown, some examples are shown on the right-hand side of the screen. And those tend to be slightly more broad and provide a recommended list of disclosure topics that can be used in ESG reporting. So some examples include the GRI and SASB standards. And then we have SBTI, which is a recommendation in terms of reaching net zero. And we also have the TCFD, factoring in on climate change, and the new TNFD, which is looking more at nature and biodiversity impacts. So it's estimated that actually the number of regulations has increased by around 155% over the last decade, which has understandably led many investors to be feeling quite confused and maybe quite overwhelmed with the number of different regulations that they may need to comply to. And often the key concerns that we see from our clients can be that they maybe don't really fully understand the scope of these regulations or who is captured, and also potentially where they fall within the various compliance windows that come into effect with a lot of these regulations. And hopefully that's where I'm going to hand over to Aoife and Bevan, who will be able to shed some more light around the complexities of EU regulation, also the TCFD. So Aoife, I'll hand over to you first.
Thank you, Eleanor. And continuing the trend on from Eleanor's scene setting and introduction about the wider drivers and general impact of regulation, I'm going to take a bit of a focus on one of the primary regulations that we've seen have a big impact on the market and also a large impact on infrastructure, and that is the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation from the European Union. The European Union has definitely positioned itself as a leader in the space of sustainable finance, and has already adopted a quite ambitious legislative landscape to support that. Just with a bit of context before we go into some more detail on SFDR and its structure and how it operates. It all comes back to that same point that Eleanor raised at the beginning around that funding gap. So the EU, like many other governments and bodies, had identified that perhaps on a voluntary basis that funding gap was not closing rapidly enough, and recognise that it wasn't achievable to put in place all the infrastructure and requirements and with all the challenges we have to face. That private capital was needed in addition to government funding and public funding. Public funding itself could not bridge that gap. And just from more detail on the European Union's perspective and the driving force behind this legislative landscape, it's all centred on the European Union's Green Deal, which is a very ambitious package which seeks to transform the European Union's economy to net zero by 2050. So we know that infrastructure is going to play a huge role in that transition. And the funding gap is demonstrated here on screen from various different reports and analysis by the EU. In their platform on sustainable finance, they estimated that there's over 600 billion per annum financing gap between now and 2030 to start to close that gap. So huge opportunity from an investment perspective, and a lot of great areas to position and to develop strategies around infrastructure products. I'm just moving on to the next slide so we can think about how did the EU take this funding gap and the challenges that they place and build a legislative landscape around it. So they built out their Sustainable Finance Action Plan, and that action plan is really centered on trying to increase transparency, trying to put a focus on risk management, and ultimately creating the framework and structure to reorientate capital towards sustainable investment. So as Eleanor has mentioned, there were many challenges around sustainability of how do I define what is sustainable, how do I position or maybe market that to investors and align with expectations in a more voluntary framework space. And now we've started to see the formalization of these elements in regulation in the European Union. The three primary legislative areas that you'll hear most about, I guess at this point in time, there still is a wide array of outcomes to come over the next couple of years, but the big impact areas that we see a lot and particularly relevant for infrastructure, the EU taxonomy, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, and the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. So these are having a significant impact on the market. The EU taxonomy was seen as really a foundational piece for the European legislative landscape and in setting out that classification system for what is sustainable and how you can measure environmental sustainability. It's a very broad system, and in its intentions, it adds a great structure and formalization of a process to determine whether something is sustainable, with its concepts like a substantial contribution to environmental criteria, but also bringing in the additional areas of do no significant harm, which the EU have fostered to try to have a broad approach to sustainability where we can't focus on one point on improving energy or carbon performance whilst ignoring impacts on water or pollution or biodiversity. So they've really tried to bring in a holistic scope under the EU taxonomy. It's very detailed, and in that lies some challenges and I guess practical day-to-day application when you get down to the project level on infrastructure. It can increase in scope and reporting requirements, and it can be quite challenging to engage with if you don't have a systematic process and a full level set understanding of its requirements. So it does take time to unpick and to apply to a strategy, but it can be a really useful communication tool. And when we look later in a couple of slides' time about some of the challenges and some of the actual positive impacts in the European Union, we can talk about some of those more specifically for infrastructure. On the other side, another cornerstone piece was the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. This was really the EU's attempt to start to standardize the disclosure and transparency around sustainability for financial market participants and for the products and funds that they place on the market and advertise and market to European Union investors. So really trying to put in a level set of sustainability requirements. And we'll look at in the next slide at some examples of how does that regulation function. And then finally, and I guess the newest wave of changes from the EU legislative landscape is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. The first round of organizations captured by this directive are gearing up for disclosures and undertaking the various materiality assessments and reviews that are required to go into that disclosure program. And we'll start to see more and more reports hit the public space in the next couple of years. It's going to grow in its scope as each year, depending on your size of your organization, your operations, etc. There will be scoping requirements which capture more and more organizations. And some JP Morgan research estimates that by 2028, there could be up to 50,000 businesses in scope of CSRD. So a huge impact on the reporting landscape, and a huge impact on the transfer of information regarding sustainability strategies and how different portfolio companies or different projects are managed will all in itself be in scope somewhere potentially for some CSRD reporting. So this one really is going to have a big impact over the next couple of years, and one definitely to look out for. But diving into more detail on the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, as this in particular over the past couple of years since 2021-22 has had the bigger impact on a driver from the perspective of sustainability. And that has been due to its focus on financial market participants and also the products that they're placing on the market. It's really important. I think the first thing, if you're not familiar with SFDR and trying to get to grips with it, there's an important concept to understand in its current functioning in the market is that by many, a vast majority, It has been misused in the market as a labeling system. It wasn't the original design intention. It was designed as a disclosure regulation just to increase the amount of transparency from an organization on its impacts on sustainability and sustainability issues impacts on its financial performance. But because of some decision making around these positioning articles, which are the Article 6, Article 8, and Article 9, which many have already probably heard of and spoken about in the market, and maybe even position some funds and products. These were being used in the market right now as almost de facto green labels. And again, it goes against the original intention. It has, I guess, for some areas had positive impacts in that it's drawn attention to, what's good enough from a sustainability perspective and setting standards. But really the regulation struggles to walk a fine line between disclosure requirements and setting minimum standards. So it kind of has blurred the lines in its regulatory setup. And I will look at the future of SFDR in a couple of slides' time, where we can see there's already an initiative to try and clean up and correct some of those misunderstandings. But it has been an important tool for managers and different organizations to convey to investors and their stakeholders their sustainability ambitions. It's basically seen as Article 6 is where you're communicating that you've no central focus or primary ambitions around sustainability. You basically explain whether you have any risk management processes around that. On Article 8, you start to get into a space of flexibility in terms of how you can position or convey your sustainability strategy. But here again, you're placing a bit more emphasis on what are called environmental or social characteristics. And that's where for infrastructure funds in particular, there's a good range of flexibility to draft and present characteristics in line with the investment strategy, bearing in mind that we could have very broad or diverse portfolios and infrastructure, and we need to maybe have that flexibility within an Article 8 position to convey that. The struggle around Article 8 is there's no clear definition of what is good enough. Is it going to meet regulatory requirements, etc.? There's no full formalized definition of minimum standards of a characteristic. So it does create some challenges for some organizations to try and measure out and be comfortable and confident in that space. And Article 9 is the area where we get more prescriptive from the regulation on what the requirements are. So here is where the regulation diverged from just these are disclosure requirements into drafting up some definitions and minimum standards, etc., around the concept of sustainable investments. And this is a space where infrastructure and also real estate, so it's a real assets or alternatives categories, has had its challenges in adopting and keeping up to speed with the different reviews and different opinions of what is a sustainable investment. And it's been a bit of a rocky transition into Article 9 space over the past couple of years. And Eleanor, if we just flick on to the next slide, we can look at this is from Morningstar. It's not specific to infrastructure or real assets, so it's a kind of broad reach of all funds, but it really, the trend follows through to infrastructure and also to real estate, where on the initial launch of SFDR back in 2021, we did have quite a lot of funds or new funds or existing funds undertaking that process to transition to the new categorization or the new positioning articles. Obviously, we had a lot of appetite around Article 8, whereas there's that flexibility to define an appropriate strategy for the investment. And over time, we did see some growth around Article 9 positioning as well. But as I mentioned, that area has been challenging as different interpretations and clarifications have come through. And you see that early 2022 period is shown with a bit of a downcast, but it also ties into a period where we saw a lot of dropping down from Article 8 or from Article 9 to Article 8 positions, again, as new definitions and understandings came through. And in particular, infrastructure and real estate, as I mentioned, have struggled in that sustainable investment definition space. Eleanor set it out lovely in the beginning of this webinar. There's lots of standards out there, you know, the UN SDGs and different ways of identifying what is sustainable infrastructure. Those frameworks were not adopted into EU taxonomy explicitly or into SFDR. So we see some of those intersections not working very well in the market, and therefore creating the challenges for managers to create the products in line with these disclosure expectations. And also we can see as we get closer through to 23, 24, where there was, I guess, global disruption in the markets and capital raising environments were a bit more challenging. And what we've actually seen in 2024, and I'll lead on to this as I talk about the future of SFDR, you can see that in Q1 and Q2, the positioning of Article 6 funds has actually increased and is a larger proportion than Article 8 funds over the past couple of years. I'll talk about the reasons behind that. And it's a couple of different drivers in there. There's obviously the high interest rate environment and general market disruptions, but there's also the evolving nature of SFDR, which I'll talk about at the future of the regulation. And there's also learnings from the past couple of years where there has been increased scrutiny on greenwashing activities, and the regulation have created a structure to allow investors and different stakeholders to uphold managers to different standards, and therefore making them more cautious around the greenwashing element. So yeah, perfect timing for the next slide. There's been a lot of positives from SFDR, not to pick on it too much. I know a lot of people do like to pick on it, but it was, the first attempt by the European Union to formalize this into a regulation. And there's been lots of learnings as well, but really from the mainline positive that I've seen is that the EU has really become a leader in this space. And in becoming a leader, it's also just set clear expectations and it's given a clear commitment and timeline to sustainable finance and to bridging that gap. So that creates a lot of stability for the market and for managers who are seeking to integrate sustainability into their strategy. So there's that confidence as well. And also around that integration piece, SFDR has, for many cases with clients we engage with, it's brought sustainability into early discussions for new funds in particular, so new products or new strategies. It's brought sustainability into those early discussions at the point before capital is raised. And sustainability isn't being put into those funds as an ad hoc measure once the investment strategy and the various investors are all on board. It's more of a front piece. In some cases, a bit last minute when the PPMs and everything are all drawn up and trying to get SFDR over the line at the end, but it still is bringing it up the agenda. And I think that's really important as well. It's also allowed investors to have a more enhanced focus and also confidence around sustainability credentials. It's giving everyone the tools and the language to talk to each other with. So I think that's been really important as well. And there's been a lot of upskilling across a lot of different organizations, investors and managers alike. So I think that's a very positive impact also. On the reporting side, to a degree, it has added some consistency to the reporting in that it has its prescribed templates and requirements set out. And I know that doesn't help anyone who currently feels overcome by reporting burdens. I think there's overall a bit of work still to be done in the disclosure space for sustainability, as we have a lot of voluntary frameworks and a lot of new regulations at the same time. But again, I think it's just put in place some consistency on the templated side. The global impact also has been a big positive from a sustainability perspective. The EU in the design of SFDR was very brave in that it can capture managers outside of Europe who don't have a physical footprint in Europe. It's really, if you raise capital from European Union investors and you're marketing your product into European Union, we support infrastructure clients who have operations globally, or maybe our head office in Australia, United States, anywhere outside of Europe, and trying to help them get to grips with this EU-based regulation with a global footprint. So again, it's been positive in terms of the European Union trying to indicate to the world its direction of travel. It's brought greenwashing into higher focus, and it's a bit more of an acute focus around the risks here. And again, it's putting more tools and structure into the market, which ultimately it may seem more like something to be concerned about, but it's more of a positive in that it's starting to create that safer space between managers and investors as well. And on the financing side, we're also starting to see infrastructure and even also in real estate, a lot of growth in green and sustainable finance offerings related to SFDR. So connecting Article 8 products that perhaps are debt products that are lending out to the market. There's a lot of growth in that area as well. So again, just creating new opportunities in space. And those are, I guess, more generalized positive impacts. And Eleanor, I know you had some specific infrastructure examples as well that are going to be really useful for the group.
Yeah, I think that those are all really good points and all very, very relevant for infrastructure. I think the one that I've definitely seen play out, I think really over the past few years, has definitely been in terms of the reporting and maybe in that standardization. I know there's still kind of a long way to go there, but I know that, well, obviously on the kind of the infrastructure equity space, we're dealing with a large number of, portfolio companies who are having to provide data to their investment manager in order for them to report to these regulations. And obviously, in terms of those infrastructure portfolio companies, sometimes that can be quite a complicated, there can be quite complicated ownership structures. And there's, been a potential for multiple investors to almost be requesting the same information topics, but maybe using slightly different metrics or different kind of reporting frameworks that they would like the company to use. And I think that the feedback that I've seen across those portfolio companies over the past 2 years, especially in terms of PAI reporting, is that they're actually seeing, I guess, efficiency from a lot of their investors asking for the same kind of information in the same format. And obviously as well, other frameworks, maybe like GRESB, are also trying to kind of come around this common set of metrics, which I think has really kind of helped. And I guess, reduce a little bit of that reporting burden, especially on those infrastructure portfolio companies who can be often quite stretched for time on ESG. So yeah, I think that's probably the main one that I would pick out of this slide as being a key positive I've seen.
Great, thank you. And just moving on now for, I guess, some of the more challenging aspects of the regulation. As I mentioned, it's really the first of its kind. So there has been some landing issues over the past couple of years. And one of the main ones has been a bit of inconsistency. And that's in terms of interpretations that are across the board. So in the European Union, when we've got a regulation from the Commission, we know that every country has a regulator within that country, and there's different interpretations there. And also there's some varying legal opinions on some of the finer points. And even some investors have different approaches and different interpretations of requirements. So it can be some grey spaces in a broad sense. And so that can be a bit of a challenge to try and unpick. And it requires, I guess, on the second point as well, with the regulation being complex and being a lot of space to develop different approaches, and depending on your strategy and your investment outlook, it can become, I guess, a bit resource intensive depending on your organization size, and that in turn can have impacts on others around you, like portfolio companies in a fund. And it requires a lot of cross-functional engagement. So, different organizations may have ESG teams or external consultants, legal advisors, fund managers, portfolio company managers, etc. So there's a lot of different cross collaboration and different resourcing requirements for it. One of the main challenges as well, not specific to infrastructure, most likely felt by everyone, is data availability. just access to reliable and accurate data to inform reporting, or even to build out a strategy knowing I can access the information to demonstrate my progress. That can be a challenge, and infrastructure is not alone there in that position. And it's part of that maturing of sustainability as a topic. I guess connected to the top as well on inconsistency, there's lack of clarity. As I mentioned, SFDR walks that line between disclosure regulation and also starting to set minimum standards on the Article 9 space. So the definition of sustainable investment, as I mentioned in particular, has been a challenging area for infrastructure and real assets in general. There's this understanding over the past couple of years of transitioning towards a sustainable activity wasn't seen as sustainable. It must be sustainable right now. And when you talk about the built environment, that is a bit more difficult to convey and to achieve 100% of the time. And one area I think I have a positive end for everyone on my final slide is about the future of SFDR, where this space could become a bit more attractive. But just to round out the final couple of challenges, I mentioned this earlier, the taxonomy application for infrastructure as well can be difficult in just the broad nature of the taxonomy, and also the broad nature of investment and portfolio companies that may be out there in an infrastructure fund. And it does take some time to grapple with. There has been, again, I mentioned this earlier, that misinterpretation of it as a green labeling system has caused some issues in the markets and in its functionality. And this all ties into my final challenge, which is very much a challenge as of now, which is the future uncertainty around the regulation. So throughout 2023 and 24, there's been consultation on SFDR and looking at what the improvement measures could be, what the future of it looks like. So that does add some uncertainty into the market as everyone gets ready to go through that next phase of unpicking the new requirements. And just to round off this section on the future of SFDR with the final slide, there is good news here in this there's no firm timeline yet on this new version of SFDR, but it is learning a lot of lessons. And I think a lot of lessons that have been an explicit challenge for infrastructure and real estate. So there could be the potential of creating new categories of funds, where you can have a sustainable focus, where you more attune to the Article 9 space about having sustainable investments that are sustainable right now. But the important area for infrastructure is a transition category. We know infrastructure is going to play a huge role in the transition of the global economy and the European economy, and having this specific product and categorization could be a really big opportunity on the market for infrastructure. So I would make sure that everyone keeps an eye on the developments of SFDR in the next couple of years and see how it further aligns into the broader market requirements. And I think this element here on transition really ties in very well to Bevan's section, because we can start to see how all of these different standards and regulations are coming together, I would say, at this point in time, and particularly with this transition element as a centerpiece. So yeah, handing over to Bevan now to take up.
Hi everyone. I'm going to focus on TCFD stroke IFRS. I think probably people are now going to be a bit more familiar with the original TCFD guidance being adopted through IFRS, and what that means for infrastructure. And I think just want to pick up on a couple of things that Eleanor and Aoife said. We are starting to see, well, not starting, we are in a world of increased urbanization and density, and so the potential cascade impacts from infrastructure failure due to a physical event can be exacerbated, but also at the heart of it, this should be about risk management. That's not a surprise coming from the risk person here. So it should all be about risk management and here what we're trying to do, or what investors or investment managers should be doing, is looking to minimize the risk of physical and transition risk on assets. It's as simple as that. And investors should be looking to scrutinize the efforts to minimize the impact of physical and transition risk. It's not enough to report that you know what your risks are. we need to now understand what you're going to do about them. And so just here very quickly, I'm not going to run through the whole thing, but this is the kind of what's different between TCFD and IFRS. The headline is not much, but there are some subtle changes that particularly when we talk about infrastructure need to be taken into account. So under the governance part, it's broadly the same. So I'm not really going to ask for more, talk about more on that. Now, the big difference is that there is a referencing industry guidance that's in the IFRS, which says, you need to now reference specific industry guidance. That is easier said than done. There is not necessarily lots of industry guidance on certain types of infrastructure. So that needs to be kind of taken on a case-by-case basis. But what I will say, particularly in the strategy piece, there is more of an uplift of things to do. So simply talking about the risks is not enough. We need to understand how resilient that asset is. What are the plans to make it more resilient or maintain its resiliency? And that needs to be backed up with evidence, whether that is on the scenarios you've used and the sources that they've come from, but also any assumptions that you've made. These need to be clearly stated. And that strategic piece, for me, is the bit that's expanded the most and is probably the most important, because effectively this is not necessarily linear. You may get to your strategy before you've sorted out your governance, or you may have taken the risk management approach to this. But at the end of the day, the strategy piece is very important for transitioning to a resilient and net zero world. So risk management, we need to know the methodology of risk assessment for climate change. And I would also add how it's integrated into your existing risk management. That's massively important. And then on the metrics and targets, what we want to see is more of an explanation around your strategy and your approach to carbon credits. That's probably one of the big takeaways there that you can see on the right-hand side. Just to talk about a couple of the other ones. Number one, more detail is required. So if you have a TCFD statement, if you've produced a TCFD statement, it will have to go up another notch of quality, because the argument from those who pull together TCFD is you can quantify all of these categories more so than they have been. You can quantify the number and the amount of time that you've spent on climate-related issues within your governance process. You can quantify the financial impact on your asset or your entity of changing a strategy to be net zero or resilient, etc. So there is a big focus on increased quantification. I'll look at number 3 here. There is going to be an increased focus on the financial implications. Now, this comes from more of a regulatory perspective. Governments, particularly the G7, who were the first to kind of really move on this, are concerned about certain sectors potentially being at over risk from climate change and not doing anything about it, which presents a national economic risk. So that's just another point there just to make. Those are the big changes from TCFD to IFRS. People still use the terms interchangeably. If we just go to the next slide, Eleanor. So just to give you an idea of the challenges that are there for infrastructure when we're talking in that disclosure, but also the kind of action context, is that the impacts on real estate assets is different from infrastructure assets. For example, on the physical side, it is unlikely to have, and in a real estate context, there is unlikely to have a downstream or cascade impact. If my legal office in central London floods, it only really affects that business and that asset. On the infrastructure side, if my power station floods, overheats in a heat wave, or is subject to any other type of climate hazard, then that potentially has a massive impact on a local economy, on a local population, and then there are legal and other impacts. But also there is a risk to the wider economy too. On the real estate side, we broadly have very kind of asset and focused policy where it's about energy usage, really, just to boil it down. The technological implementation is about decarbonisation and electrifying our grid. And that then translates into any market risks where we will have people saying, I want to lease a net zero or an efficient asset. And if that is not electrified, then you're opening yourself up to some kind of premature devaluation of that asset. On the infrastructure side, the interdependencies, I've already talked about the cascade risk, but the interdependencies can be exacerbated. A physical event somewhere over there can affect something over here. And equally, a physical effect there can influence the piece of infrastructure and have an impact on that. Stranding is more of an outsized risk in terms of infrastructure. If your infrastructure is continually falling over because of physical risks, it is eventually going to become stranded, and it's not going to earn its lifetime, basically. Integration of new technology is a lot more difficult because we have varied infrastructure, we have different infrastructure, and one day I could be talking about rail infrastructure, the next I could be talking about telecommunication or fiber optic infrastructure, both of which have different impacts and different potential changes in terms of climate risks. And then market risks are going to be much more focused at the front end in terms of the ability of trying to raise capital, as opposed to a tenant or a user having some kind of influence on the decarbonisation of the asset, like we see in real estate, particularly, for example, offices. So that's just to balance up the differences there. And then my last slide and the last slide, this. So really, for me, there's 5 things that people need to be thinking about in relation to infrastructure, about how to disclose and manage these risks. And I say disclose and manage because disclosure is one thing, and we've all seen the explosion in recruitment of reporting managers and across different businesses. That has a limited lifespan. This stuff needs to be integrated into your existing reporting, but it also then needs to translate into action. So that's one of the things to take away there. TCFD remains the key guidance. If in doubt, just refer to the original TCFD report. It's still very good, but just be conscious of the changes for IFRS. There is increasing scrutiny from big industry frameworks and reporting frameworks like GRESB and CDP. And rather than just being used as a tick box and trying to get GRESB points or meet a CDP threshold, the questions that are in these disclosures are very useful for presenting internally and to other stakeholders who aren't necessarily familiar with this. And the challenge that they present in terms of evidence and evidence of action is a useful exercise for organizations to go through. Be transparent. If you haven't done it, say it. If you're doing it, say you're doing it. If you've done it, say you've done it and show it. And I think it's very simple for disclosure with TCFD. It is about being transparent. There is a realization that still 7 years after the guidance came out, people are still trying to get to grips with this. But also for number 4, be prepared for a world where everything from governance downwards must be quantified, as I've already said. And then partly, and this is where the graphic is from, develop a credible transition plan that addresses net zero, but also your exposure to physical and transition risk. And this is from the TPT guidance and should be read through. You have to set your ambition. You've got to do something about it in terms of actions, and you've got to have some accountability. And I think most people have probably got the ambition, and there's an accountability element there, but increasingly the focus is going to be on doing something about it. That's me.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks, Bevan. Thanks, Aoife. That was very interesting. So I'm conscious of time, but I think we probably have time just to finish with a quick summary of the themes that we've covered today and talk about some of maybe the key challenges that we see in the infrastructure space when aligning to these ESG regulations. And I think we've summarised maybe the most important factors on the screen here. And the first one being data availability. And as we've mentioned, a lot of the time, especially in the infrastructure space, the data that we need to report to these frameworks can come from various stakeholders within the company, within the investment management company itself, but also across portfolio companies, or in the situation of debt, a number of different borrowers. And this means that often data can be kind of considered to be stored in different formats, sometimes on Excel, sometimes in various softwares, and also that data is often collected upon different frequencies and sometimes using different calculation methodologies. So I think in the short term, this can seem like quite an intimidating task. However, I think there's definitely efficiencies to be had, and we found this with a lot of our clients. Once they've kind of mapped the source of the data and identified the main channels, this can be quite significantly simplified. The second one being time and cost. And I think that this is probably, if not the biggest concern that we see in the market and across the clients that we work with. Again, bringing it back to that point around, we're working with a number of different portfolio companies here, where potentially, the number of stakeholders, and also we see, a varied willingness to collect and provide data, means that this can be a really key challenge. And here, obviously, there's need for the implementation of training and education, and also potentially expenses in relation to the creation of new ESG roles to make sure that this data is provided and kind of focused in the right areas. As maybe Aoife touched on a little bit, obviously there's a need for clarity with a lot of these regulations. So these regulations are imposed mainly for all kind of financial market participants. So there's work needed, I guess, to address exactly how these standards apply to the real asset, or more specifically, the infrastructure space. And I think that obviously, as we mentioned, with the varied nature of infrastructure investment, that means that sometimes the investments don't always fit kind of neatly within the standards, such as the taxonomy or within the TCFD recommendations, and providing a definition for what is sustainable that meets, and is relevant to all sectors can be very, very difficult. And finally, obviously, there's a kind of an understood feeling that there is a lot of fragmentation at the moment, and the market could be seen to be quite oversaturated with a number of different disclosure standards. I think that obviously, like Bevan touched on, there is kind of some hope here with the creation of the IFRS and the announced creation of the ISSB as well, which is the intention there, I guess, is to create a more global ESG reporting standard that can establish an easier kind of global baseline, which allows us to, gain an aspect of comparability between disclosures. However, I think we'll probably all agree that there's probably still quite a long way to go before we can say that all of these standards are truly kind of standardized, I suppose. So I guess that leads us on to our final slide, and perhaps this is more of a kind of a thought to take away with you. But I guess what we're seeing amongst the market is that there's an increasing amount of reporting, not only to these regulatory standards that we've outlined today, but also to various benchmarking and rating standards such as GRESB. And there's, I guess, overall an increasing volume of ESG data that's now available to investors. And this kind of begs the question, do we have too much ESG data, or maybe not enough? And I think maybe most of us would probably argue that increasing levels of ESG data are generally a positive thing. However, I think from our insights in the market, we often see that the quantity of data is perhaps sometimes not the problem. Instead, the quality of the data can sometimes be the limiting factor. So I think we would encourage all investment managers really consider the actions that they can take now in order to ensure that data verification is happening and that there's consistency amongst the data that they report. Especially when using proxy estimations, where we have data gaps as well. And I think as part of that, we would also encourage investment managers to consider the materiality of the information that they collect and what information is most useful or impactful to their stakeholders. I think overall, leaving on a positive, I think it's clear that the industry is going through a huge period of transformation at the moment, and there's definitely an opportunity for regulation to pave the way to a more efficient use of data that ultimately achieves the aims, which are to direct capital into the transitioning and the enablement of a more sustainable future. So that's the end of our slides today. Thank you very much for listening. I know we had hoped we'd have a little bit more time for the Q&A, but we're kind of running out of time now. So it might be that we might be better maybe to follow up on an email potentially afterwards. We're planning to share the slides with you this week, so we can always kind of follow up on any questions that you guys might have at that point. So thank you very much for listening today. We really appreciate the time that you've taken. And we would also say that just to make you aware, we also have some upcoming infrastructure events we have in relation with GRESB. So we have some of the regional insights events planned for real estate and infrastructure. So keep an eye on our socials to follow on kind of the developments and where you can sign up for those events. So yeah, that's everything from me. Thank you very much, everyone, for your time. Bye.
Thank you.